The abandoned Millfield Farm sat like a broken promise against the Montana skyline, its rotting barn doors hanging open like a scream. Jake "Razor" Morrison gunned his Harley up the gravel drive, following the desperate howls that had been haunting him for 3 days. The stench hit him first: death, decay, and something worse. Then he saw them. 200 dogs crammed into makeshift cages, their ribs showing through matted fur, eyes hollow with hunger and fear. Most people would have called animal control and walked away. But Jake wasn't most people. 20 years ago, before the leather jacket and gang colors, he'd been Dr. Jacob Morrison, a veterinarian who'd lost everything in one terrible night. Now, staring at the largest illegal dogfighting operation he'd ever seen, Jake faced an impossible choice: walk away and let them die, or risk exposing the secret that had kept him alive all these years. The farm wasn't abandoned, it was a trap, and somewhere in the shadows, the people who'd been using these dogs as weapons were watching, waiting. But what Jake discovered in that barn would change everything, including the answer to one burning question: can a man running from his past find redemption in the most unlikely place? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake killed the engine and stepped off his bike, the leather of his boots crunching on broken glass and scattered hay. The howling intensified as the dogs caught his scent, their voices rising in a desperate chorus that cut through the Montana wind like a prayer. He'd heard that sound before, in his nightmares, in the memories he'd spent 2 decades trying to bury. His hand instinctively moved to the knife on his belt, then stopped. These weren't enemies, they were victims. The nearest cage held a pit bull mix, her white coat stained with blood and filth. She pressed against the wire mesh, not growling or snapping, but whimpering. Her eyes, God, those eyes, held an intelligence that pierced straight through his carefully constructed armor. She knew he was different. She knew he might help. "Easy, girl," Jake whispered, his voice rusty with disuse. He hadn't spoken gently to anything in years. "I see you." As he moved deeper into the barn, the scope of the horror became clear. Row after row of cages stretched into the shadows, each one holding 2 or 3 dogs in spaces barely large enough for one. Makeshift fighting rings occupied the center of the barn, their dirt floors dark with old blood. Empty water bowls sat just out of reach of desperate tongues. Food dishes contained nothing but mold and maggots. This wasn't just neglect, this was systematic torture. Jake's trained eye catalogued injuries: infected wounds from fights, broken bones that had healed crooked, missing ears and tails. But worse than the physical damage was the psychological trauma he recognized in their movements. Some dogs cowered when he approached, others stared with the flat, empty gaze of creatures who had given up hope entirely. That's when he heard the footsteps. Jake spun around as 3 men emerged from the shadows near the barn's rear entrance. The leader was tall and lean, with the kind of expensive clothes that looked wrong in a place like this. His companions were muscle, thick necks, dead eyes, hands that rested too casually near concealed weapons. "You lost, biker?" the leader asked, his voice carrying the soft menace of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Jake straightened to his full height, letting his Hell's Angels colors show clearly. "Just checking out the neighborhood. Heard there might be some business opportunities around here." The lie came easily. It had to. His real name was on a federal witness protection list that these men would kill to get their hands on. Dr. Jacob Morrison had testified against the wrong people 20 years ago. Jake "Razor" Morrison was supposed to keep his head down and stay invisible. "This is private property," the leader said, stepping closer, "and our business arrangements are very exclusive." Behind him, the dogs continued their chorus of desperation. Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a familiar weight he'd tried to forget, the same feeling he'd had in his clinic when faced with an animal that everyone else had written off as hopeless. "Maybe we could discuss terms," Jake said carefully. "I've got connections, money to invest." As if to underscore his point, a massive German shepherd in a nearby cage began barking, a sound full of rage and pain. The other dogs joined in, creating a wall of sound that seemed to shake the barn's rotting beams. Jake nodded and backed toward his bike, every instinct screaming at him to run. But as he reached the barn door, he made a promise to the 200 souls trapped behind him. He was coming back. The stench hit Jake like a physical blow as he kicked down the barn door, the rusted hinges screaming in protest. What he found inside made his stomach lurch and his fists clench involuntarily. Rows of makeshift cages constructed from chain-link fencing and scrap metal stretched into the shadows, each one containing the skeletal remains of what had once been powerful dogs. Most were pit bulls, their ribs visible through matted fur, eyes sunken but still holding a flicker of hope when they saw him. A few German shepherds cowered in the back corners, and he spotted what looked like a Rottweiler mix that could barely lift its massive head. The smell of waste, infection, and death was overwhelming. "Jesus Christ," Jake muttered, pulling his bandana up over his nose. He'd seen plenty of ugly things in his 43 years. Bar fights that ended in blood, brothers who didn't make it home from runs, the aftermath of territory disputes. But this was different. This was calculated cruelty. A weak whimper drew his attention to the nearest cage. A brindle pit bull, probably female, was trying to stand. Her back legs wouldn't support her weight, but she kept trying, tail attempting a pathetic wag. Jake knelt down and extended his hand through the chain link. The dog's nose was dry and cracked, but she managed to give his fingers a tentative lick. "Easy, girl, easy." His mind raced as he surveyed the scene. 200 dogs, maybe more. Most were alive, but barely. Some cages held only bones and fur. The water bowls were bone-dry, cracked plastic containers that looked like they hadn't been filled in weeks. The few food dishes he could see contained nothing but moldy remnants. Jake pulled out his phone and started taking pictures, his military training kicking in automatically. Document everything, the cages, the conditions, the animals. Evidence. His hands shook slightly as he worked, not from fear, but from rage building like pressure in a boiler. He'd grown up with dogs. His grandmother had rescued strays, turning their small house into an unofficial shelter. She'd taught him that you could judge a person's character by how they treated animals that couldn't fight back. Looking at this horror show, Jake knew he was dealing with monsters. A sound from deeper in the barn made him freeze. Not animal sounds, footsteps, heavy boots on concrete. Jake slipped his phone back into his jacket and moved toward the noise, his boots silent despite their size. 3 doors down, he found the source. The man was tall and thin, wearing expensive jeans and a polo shirt that looked out of place in this hellhole. He was checking something on a clipboard, moving between cages with the casual indifference of someone inspecting inventory. When he looked up and saw Jake, his face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, fear, then calculation. "You lost, friend?" the man asked, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "This is private property. Looks like a crime scene to me," Jake replied, not moving from the doorway. The man's hand drifted toward his waistband. "You need to leave. Now." "Not happening." They stared at each other for a long moment. Jake could see the man weighing his options, probably wondering if he could take down someone built like a linebacker. The smart money said no, but desperation made people stupid. "Look," the man said, his tone shifting to negotiation. "I don't know what you think you saw here, but these animals are part of a legitimate breeding operation. Sometimes you lose a few. That's just business." Breeding operation. Jake's voice was flat, dangerous. For what? The man's smile was cold. Entertainment. That single word confirmed what Jake had already suspected. Dogfighting. Not just some redneck weekend hobby, but something organized, professional. The kind of operation that moved money and attracted the sort of people who considered suffering a spectacle. "Who's running this?" Jake asked. Jake took a step forward. The man pulled a pistol, a small caliber piece that looked more suited for intimidation than stopping power. Amateur move. Jake had been shot at by professionals in Afghanistan. This guy was a desk jockey with delusions. "Last chance," the man said, his voice cracking slightly. "For you, maybe." "Now," Jake said, kneeling beside the groaning figure. "Let's talk about who's really running this show." Outside, storm clouds were gathering, and Jake realized his simple Sunday ride had just become something much more complicated. The silence in the abandoned farmhouse felt heavy as Jake stepped through the splintered doorframe, his boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The stench hit him immediately, a nauseating cocktail of rotting food, human waste, and something darker he couldn't quite identify. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and pressed forward. The first room had been gutted, walls stripped down to bare studs, but Jake could see evidence of recent habitation. Empty beer bottles clustered around a makeshift table constructed from cinder blocks and plywood. Cigarette butts littered the floor like fallen leaves. On the table, scattered papers caught his attention. Receipts, betting slips, and what looked like a ledger filled with cramped handwriting. Jake picked up the ledger, squinting at the entries. Numbers, dates, and names he didn't recognize. But the dollar amounts made his breath catch. Thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, all dated within the last 6 months. A sound from deeper in the house made him freeze. Not the whimpering of dogs this time, something else. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the knife on his belt as he crept toward the back of the house. The hallway stretched before him, doors hanging open like missing teeth. He moved past a bathroom where the fixtures had been ripped out, past a bedroom containing nothing but a stained mattress and more empty bottles. The footsteps had stopped. Jake paused at the last door, pressing his back against the wall. Through the opening he could see into what must have been the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through a broken window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. And there, standing with his back to the doorway, was a man. He was tall and thin, wearing a dirty flannel shirt that hung loose on his bony frame. His hair was long and greasy, pulled back in a ponytail that hadn't seen a wash in weeks. He stood perfectly still, as if listening. Jake held his breath, debating his options. The smart play was to back away, get to his bike, and call the police. Let them sort out whatever was happening here. But something about the man's stillness, the way he seemed to be waiting, made Jake's skin crawl. The man spoke without turning around. "You're not supposed to be here." His voice was raspy, like sandpaper on wood. Jake stepped into the doorway, keeping his distance. "Neither are you, looks like." The man turned slowly, revealing a face that looked like it had been carved from old leather. Deep lines etched around his eyes, and a scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw. When he smiled, Jake saw gaps where teeth should have been. "This is my place," the man said. "Has been for months now. Funny. The dogs outside suggest you're not much of a caretaker." The man's smile faltered. "Dogs are business, not pets." Jake felt his jaw clench. "What kind of business?" Instead of answering, the man reached slowly into his back pocket. Jake tensed, ready to move, but the man only pulled out a cigarette pack. He shook one loose and lit it with practiced ease, never taking his eyes off Jake. "You ride with a club," the man observed, nodding toward the leather vest visible beneath Jake's jacket. "Hell's Angels. I can tell by the way you carry yourself. You know the Angels?" "I know lots of people, lots of different kinds of business." The man took a long drag. "Question is, what kind of business are you in?" Jake studied the man's face, looking for tells. In his years with the club, he'd learned to read people quickly. This one was dangerous, not in the explosive, unpredictable way of a tweaker or drunk, but in the cold, calculating way of someone who'd done terrible things and made peace with it. "I'm in the business of making sure those dogs get fed," Jake said finally. The man's laugh was like gravel in a blender. "Those dogs are worth more money than you've ever seen. They're bred for a specific purpose, trained for a specific job. You feed them wrong, you mess up months of preparation. Preparation for what?" The man's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Nothing you need to worry about, nothing that concerns you or your club." Jake took a step closer. "It concerns me now." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The man flicked his cigarette onto the floor and ground it under his heel. "Walk away," he said quietly. "Take your bike and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Forget you ever saw this place, because if you don't, if you start sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, you're going to find out there are worse things than starving dogs." Jake met the man's stare and held it. "Is that a threat?" The man smiled again, and this time it was all teeth and malice. "That's a promise." The first thing Jake noticed when he rolled up to the compound wasn't the silence. It was the smell. Even with his bandana pulled up over his nose, the stench of rotten death cut through the morning air like a blade. He'd been riding hard since dawn, the address from Murphy's contact burning a hole in his leather jacket pocket. The place looked abandoned from the road. Rusted gates hung open on broken hinges, and weeds choked the gravel driveway. But Jake's trained eye caught the details that mattered: fresh tire tracks in the mud, cigarette butts that weren't weathered, and security cameras hidden among the dead branches of an old oak tree. He killed the Harley's engine and sat for a moment, listening. Somewhere beyond the dilapidated farmhouse he could hear them, the dogs, not barking but whimpering. The sound made his chest tight. Jake had seen plenty of ugly things in his 43 years. Drug deals gone bad, bodies in ditches, men who'd forgotten what mercy meant. But there was something about the helpless suffering of animals that cut deeper than human cruelty ever could. Maybe because they never chose this life. He left his bike hidden behind a collapsed barn and approached on foot, staying low. The compound was bigger than it looked from the road, several outbuildings scattered across 20 acres, connected by worn paths through the scrub. The whimpering grew louder as he moved toward what looked like a series of makeshift kennels. The first pen nearly dropped him to his knees. 12 pit bulls crammed into a space meant for 3. Their ribs showed like prison bars under matted fur, and most bore the telltale scars of the fighting ring: torn ears, bite marks, infected wounds that had never seen a vet. One dog, a massive red-nosed male, lay motionless in the corner. Jake couldn't tell if he was dead or just too weak to move. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, and several dogs lifted their heads at the sound. Their eyes held no hope, only the dull acceptance of creatures who'd given up on rescue. Jake pulled out his phone, fingers shaking as he documented everything. Each photo felt like a punch to the gut, but he knew he'd need evidence. The cops would want proof, and more importantly, so would the rescue organizations that Murphy's contact had mentioned. A sound made him freeze, the distant rumble of truck engines coming up the drive. Jake dropped behind a stack of empty dog crates, his heart hammering. Through the slats, he watched 2 pickups roll into the compound. 4 men climbed out, talking and laughing like they were heading to a Sunday barbecue instead of a place that reeked of death. "Tony wants the brown bitch moved to the main pit," one of them said, a heavy-set man with arms like tree trunks. "Says she's ready for the weekend matches." "Which brown bitch?" Another laughed. "Half these mutts look the same when they're half dead." Jake's hands clenched into fists. These weren't desperate people driven to crime by poverty or addiction. These were businessmen talking about torture like it was inventory management. The men split up, 2 heading toward the main building while the others approached the kennels. Jake pressed himself deeper into the shadows, watching as they dragged a trembling female pit bull from one of the pens. The dog didn't resist, couldn't resist. She'd learned that fighting back only made the pain worse. As the men disappeared into what Jake now realized was the main fighting arena, he made his decision. Murphy's contact had given him names of people who could help, but that would take time, paperwork, bureaucracy, legal channels. These dogs didn't have time. Jake crept back toward his bike, already planning. He'd need supplies. Bolt cutters for the chain-link fences, a truck to transport the animals, maybe some backup in case things went sideways. The smart play would be to call it in and let the authorities handle it. But Jake had never been accused of being smart, and somewhere in those pens, 200 souls were counting on someone to give a damn. He fired up the Harley and rolled slowly down the drive, keeping the engine quiet until he reached the main road. Then he opened her up, racing toward town with a list forming in his head. Murphy would think he'd lost his mind. Hell, maybe he had. But as the wind whipped past his face, Jake found himself thinking about the red-nosed male in the first pen. Still breathing, despite everything. Still fighting to survive. Sometimes that was all it took, one stubborn bastard refusing to give up. The warehouse reeked of blood, sweat, and fear. Jake crouched behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, watching as men in expensive suits placed bets, while pit bulls tore each other apart in a makeshift ring below. His stomach churned, but he forced himself to stay focused. This was what he'd come for, evidence of the fighting operation that had left those dogs starving on the farm. His phone vibrated silently. A text from Maria, 3 more died tonight. We need to move faster. Jake's jaw clenched. Every hour they waited, more dogs suffered. He pulled out the small camera Dr. Martinez had given him and began recording, capturing the faces of the spectators, the handlers, and most importantly, the man running the show, a silver-haired figure in a $1,000 suit who commanded the room with quiet authority. "Beautiful work, isn't it?" a voice said behind him. Jake spun around to find Viper emerging from the shadows, flanked by 2 club members Jake didn't recognize. The VP's scarred face wore an expression of cold amusement. "You always were too soft, Reaper. Following you here was easier than tracking a bleeding deer." "This isn't club business," Jake said, slowly rising to his feet. "Walk away." Viper laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Everything you do reflects on the club, and right now you're making us look weak. Caring about a bunch of mutts? The brothers are starting to wonder if you've lost your edge." "The brothers can kiss my ass." That attitude is exactly the problem. Viper stepped closer, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "You've been running your own agenda too long. Time to remember where your loyalty belongs." Below them, another fight ended with a sickening yelp. The crowd roared its approval. Jake felt his control slipping, the familiar rage building in his chest, but this time, it wasn't directed at his usual targets. It was focused entirely on the men profiting from this misery. "My loyalty," Jake said quietly, "is to doing what's right." Since when? The question hit harder than Jake expected. Since when did he care about doing the right thing? He'd spent 15 years with the Angels, building a reputation as someone who solved problems with his fists and asked questions later. But standing in that warehouse, watching innocent animals suffer for entertainment, something fundamental had shifted inside him. "Since I saw what real monsters look like," he answered. Viper's expression darkened. "You're done, Reaper. Hand over whatever evidence you've collected, walk away from those dogs, and maybe the club votes to let you stay. Keep pushing this crusade, and you'll find yourself on the wrong end of club justice." Is that a threat? It's a promise. The 2 men flanking Viper moved slightly, hands drifting toward concealed weapons. Jake calculated his options. He could take Viper in a straight fight, but 3-on-1 in a confined space changed the odds considerably. More importantly, if he fought them here, it would blow his cover and ruin any chance of gathering more evidence. "I need time to think about it," Jake said finally. "You've got until tomorrow night. Club meeting at 8. Be there with your answer." Viper turned to leave, then paused. "And Jake, don't make the mistake of thinking those dogs are worth dying for, because that's where this path leads." After they disappeared into the maze of containers, Jake remained motionless for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the fights below. His phone buzzed again, another text from Maria with an update on the dog's conditions. 3 more had been stabilized, but 2 others were touch and go. He thought about Viper's ultimatum. In 24 hours, he'd have to choose between the club that had been his family for 15 years and a pack of broken animals he barely knew. By any rational measure, it shouldn't have been a difficult decision. The Hell's Angels had given him purpose, brotherhood, and identity when he'd had nothing else. But as he watched another terrified dog get dragged into the ring below, Jake realized the choice had already been made. Maybe it had been made the moment he'd seen those starving faces looking up at him through the chain-link fence. Maybe it had been made when Maria had looked at him with something other than fear or judgment in her eyes. Or maybe it had been building for years, waiting for the right moment to surface. He finished recording and carefully made his way back through the warehouse. Tomorrow night's meeting would determine his future with the club, but tonight he had work to do. The silver-haired man was still taking bets, and Jake needed to know who he was and how deep this operation ran. As he reached his motorcycle, Jake pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number Dr. Martinez had given him, Detective Sarah Chen, someone who supposedly could be trusted. It was time to stop working alone. The veterinary clinic buzzed with controlled chaos as Jake pushed through the glass doors, his leather jacket drawing sideways glances from the morning clientele. Dr. Sarah Chen looked up from behind the reception desk, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to genuine concern when she saw his face. "We need to talk," Jake said quietly, approaching the counter. "Privately." Sarah nodded, recognizing the gravity in his voice. She'd been treating the rescued dogs for 3 weeks now, and each examination had revealed more disturbing details about their condition. The systematic nature of their injuries, the specific muscle development patterns, the carefully maintained aggression levels. It all pointed to something far more sinister than simple neglect. "Room 3, she said, leading him down a hallway lined with the soft whimpers of recovering animals. Once inside, she closed the door and faced him. "The blood work came back on the last batch of dogs you brought in." Jake's jaw tightened. "And?" "Performance-enhancing drugs, steroids, amphetamines, even experimental compounds I've never seen before." Sarah pulled out a manila folder thick with test results. "Jake, these animals weren't just being fought, they were being engineered." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd suspected the fighting ring was larger than initially apparent, but this suggested an operation with serious financial backing and scientific resources. "How sophisticated are we talking?" Jake's phone buzzed with a text message. The number was unfamiliar, but the message made his blood run cold. "Stop asking questions or join your dogs in cages." He showed the screen to Sarah, whose face paled. "They know about you," she said. "They've known about me since the first night I brought dogs here," Jake replied, his mind racing through the implications. "Question is, how long before they decide I'm more trouble than I'm worth?" Before Sarah could respond, the clinic's front desk phone rang. Through the thin walls, they could hear the receptionist's increasingly agitated voice. Moments later, a knock came at the door. "Dr. Chen?" The receptionist's voice was strained. "There are some men here asking about the rescued dogs. They say they're from animal control, but they don't have proper identification." Jake and Sarah exchanged grim looks. "Back exit?" he asked. Through the surgical suite she nodded, but they both knew running would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. "No, I'm done hiding." He opened the door and walked toward the front lobby, Sarah close behind. 3 men in cheap suits stood near the reception desk, their presence making the small space feel cramped and threatening. The largest one, with scarred knuckles and eyes like chips of flint, stepped forward when he saw Jake. "Mr. Torres," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent Jake couldn't place. "My employers would like to have a conversation with you." "Your employers can make an appointment like everyone else," Jake replied, positioning himself between the men and Sarah. The scarred man smiled without warmth. "I don't think you understand the situation. You've taken something that doesn't belong to you. Those dogs represent a significant investment. Those dogs were dying in cages. Those dogs were inventory, valuable inventory that you've contaminated with your misguided compassion." The man took another step closer. "My employers are reasonable people. Return the remaining animals, stop interfering with their business operations, and this unfortunate misunderstanding can be forgotten." Jake felt the familiar surge of rage that had gotten him into trouble countless times before, but this time he channeled it differently. "And if I refuse, then you'll discover that there are worse fates than the ones you rescued those animals from." "I need time to think about it," Jake said finally. 24 hours, the scarred man replied. After that, our conversation becomes significantly less civil. The three men filed out as abruptly as they'd entered, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with menace. Jake turned to Sarah, who was gripping the edge of the reception desk with white knuckles. "I'm sorry," he said. "I never meant for this to touch you." Sarah straightened, and Jake saw something fierce kindle in her eyes. "Those dogs in there are alive because you refuse to walk away. If these people think they can intimidate me into abandoning them, they've seriously misjudged the situation." Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since this began, he wasn't facing the darkness alone. "Shit," Jake muttered, recognizing the type immediately. These weren't local law enforcement or animal control. These were the kind of men who made problems disappear. He'd been at the farm for 3 days straight, sleeping in his truck when exhaustion finally claimed him. The emergency veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Chen, had been coming twice daily, and they'd managed to stabilize 12 of the most critical dogs. But now, watching the suit scan the property with calculating eyes, Jake realized his window of operating under the radar had just slammed shut. The suited man knocked on the farmhouse door with 3 measured raps. Jake didn't answer. Through the kitchen window, he could see the muscle checking the perimeter of the property, moving with military precision. These weren't amateurs. "Mr. Torino," the suit called out, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I think we should have a conversation." Jake's blood went cold. They knew his name. In his world, when strangers knew your name and showed up with hired muscle, conversations usually ended with someone bleeding out in a ditch. "I represent certain business interests that may have been disrupted by your humanitarian efforts," the man continued. "We're hoping to reach an understanding." The back door. Jake remembered the rotted wooden door that led from the kitchen to the rear of the property. He grabbed his phone and the emergency medical supplies Dr. Chen had left, moving silently across the creaking floorboards. Some of the stronger dogs in the kitchen lifted their heads as he passed, their eyes tracking his movement with an intelligence that suggested they understood danger better than most humans. Jake deleted the message and slipped out the back door. The muscle was nowhere in sight, but that didn't mean much. He stayed low, using the outbuildings as cover while working his way toward the largest barn where most of the dogs were recovering. Inside the barn, he found chaos. Someone had been there first. Cages were overturned, medical supplies scattered. But the dogs were gone, not dead, gone. Every single one of them had vanished, leaving behind only the lingering smell of fear and the sound of vehicles driving away in the distance. Looking for something? Jake spun around to find the muscle standing in the barn doorway, a pistol hanging casually at his side. Up close, the man looked like he'd been carved from granite and disappointment. "The dogs," Jake said, keeping his voice steady. "Where are they?" "Relocated. Consider it a business expense." The man stepped closer. "My employer is a reasonable man. He understands that sometimes good intentions lead to unfortunate complications. He's prepared to overlook your interference in exchange for your complete cooperation going forward." "What kind of cooperation?" "The kind where you forget this place exists. Forget what you saw. Forget those animals ever suffered." The man's smile was colder than a January morning. "In return, you keep breathing. Your club keeps operating without federal harassment. Everyone wins." Jake looked around the empty barn, seeing the bloodstains on the concrete where the weakest dogs had been lying just hours before. These animals had survived weeks of torture, had started to trust again, had begun healing. Now they were gone, disappeared back into a nightmare that made money for men in expensive suits. "And if I don't forget?" The weight of the man's words settled on Jake's shoulders like a concrete blanket. He'd seen enough violence to know this wasn't a bluff. These people had the resources to make him disappear and the connections to ensure no one asked hard questions afterward. But as he stood in that empty barn, something Dr. Chen had said echoed in his mind. Animals don't have anyone else to speak for them. If we don't stand up, who will? Jake met the muscle's cold stare. I need time to think. You've got until midnight. After that, the offer expires and we solve this problem the permanent way. The man holstered his weapon and walked away, leaving Jake alone with the ghosts of 200 broken animals and a choice that would define whether he lived as a coward or died as something better. The warehouse district felt like a graveyard at 2 in the morning. Jake cut his engine 3 blocks away from the target location, letting his Harley coast silently into the shadows between 2 abandoned buildings. The information Tommy had squeezed from his contact was burning in his mind. Building 47, 3rd Tuesday of every month, fight starting at midnight. He'd spent the last hour circling the area, noting security patterns and escape routes. Old habits from his military days kicked in automatically. The building sat like a concrete fortress, its windows either boarded up or painted black, but the steady stream of expensive cars pulling into the rear lot told him everything he needed to know. Marcus emerged from behind a shipping container, moving with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in darkness. "Counted at least 40 vehicles so far," he whispered. "Mercedes, BMWs, couple of Bentleys. This isn't some back-alley operation." Jake nodded, checking his phone. The recording app was ready, his camera charged. "Sarah in position?" "Quarter-mile out with the van. Doc's got the emergency medical supplies loaded." Marcus pulled out a small earpiece. "We're connected on a private channel. 3 clicks means abort, 5 means we need extraction." They moved toward the building, staying low and using the shadows cast by abandoned machinery. The sound hit them first, a low rumble of voices punctuated by sudden roars of excitement or anger. As they got closer, Jake could make out individual shouts, the savage bark of dogs, and underneath it all, something that made his blood run cold, whimpering. A fire escape ladder hung just within reach on the building's side. Jake boosted Marcus up first, then followed, their boots silent on the metal rungs. The roof access was locked, but Marcus produced a small toolkit that made quick work of it. Inside, the building opened into a maze of catwalks and support beams overlooking the main floor. The scene below made Jake's hands clench into fists. A makeshift arena had been constructed in the center of the warehouse, surrounded by tiered seating filled with well-dressed spectators. Men in $1,000 suits cheered as 2 dogs, both painfully thin, both bearing the scars of previous fights, tore into each other in the ring below. Money changed hands rapidly as bets were placed and settled. But it was the holding area that made Jake's vision go red. Dozens of dogs were crammed into small cages, many bearing fresh wounds, others lying motionless. He recognized several breeds from the farm, the missing dogs Sarah had mentioned. They'd been here being conditioned for this hell. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed into his earpiece. "You getting this?" Jake was already recording, his phone capturing both video and audio. The crowd was loud enough that he could make out conversations from the catwalks. Names were being dropped, bets discussed in casual tones that treated the suffering below like entertainment. A man in an expensive suit stepped into the ring, raising his hands for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our preliminary matches. Now for tonight's main event, fresh meat from our rural acquisition." Jake's blood turned to ice as handlers brought out 2 dogs he recognized immediately. Brutus, the scarred pit bull from the farm who'd been too injured to move. And beside him, the young shepherd mix Sarah had been particularly worried about, both animals showing signs of recent conditioning and starvation. "That's it," Jake whispered into his mic. "I'm going down there." "Negative." Marcus grabbed his arm. "We need the evidence first. Get the faces, the money trail. Sarah's working the legal angle, but we need proof." Jake forced himself to keep recording even as every instinct screamed at him to act. He captured clear footage of the ringleader, the handlers, the crowd. His phone picked up names, amounts, locations of future events. It was exactly what they needed to bring down the entire operation. But when the bell rang and the 2 dogs were released into the ring, something inside Jake snapped. The shepherd was barely more than a puppy, terrified and confused. Brutus, despite his injuries, moved to protect the younger dog rather than attack, positioning himself as a shield. The crowd booed, demanding violence. One of the handlers produced an electric prod, moving toward the dogs to force aggression. Jake was moving before he realized it, swinging down from the catwalk on a support cable. He landed hard in the ring, his boots hitting the sawdust with a thud that echoed through the suddenly silent warehouse. "Show's over," he announced, spreading his arms wide to protect both dogs behind him. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before chaos erupted. Spectators screamed and rushed for exits, while security moved in from all sides. Jake heard Marcus curse over the earpiece, then the sound of his partner descending to back him up. The ringleader's face twisted with rage. "Kill him. Kill them all." Jake smiled grimly, adrenaline flooding his system. Sometimes you had to abandon the plan and trust your instincts. Tonight, that meant fighting. "You sure about this, brother?" Tank muttered, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "Once we're in there, we're committed." Marcus nodded, though his stomach churned. 3 weeks had passed since they'd rescued the dogs from Morrison's farm, and every lead had brought them closer to this moment. The underground fighting circuit was bigger than he'd imagined, spanning 3 states with connections to drug trafficking, human trafficking, and enough dirty money to corrupt half the police force. They rounded a corner and found themselves facing a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and scars crisscrossing his face. He looked them up and down, taking in their Hell's Angels patches. "You the boys Viper sent?" His voice sounded like gravel in a blender. "That's right," Tank answered smoothly. "Heard you got some action tonight." The bouncer jerked his thumb toward a steel door. "Entry fees $5,000, cash only. And your phones stay here." Marcus pulled out a thick roll of bills, money they'd scraped together by pawning everything they could. His hands shook slightly as he counted it out, not from nerves but from rage at what they were about to witness. Inside, the warehouse had been converted into a gladiatorial arena from hell. Tiered seating surrounded a fighting pit, maybe 20 feet across, enclosed by chain-link fencing that rose 12 feet high. The crowd was a mix of bikers, street thugs, and men in expensive suits who probably had corner offices in downtown high-rises. All of them screaming for blood. Marcus gripped the railing so hard his knuckles went white. Tank placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Easy, brother. We stick to the plan." They'd spent days working out every detail. Hidden in Marcus's jacket was a tiny camera, no bigger than a button, that would record everything. Tank carried a GPS tracker that would mark their location for the FBI task force waiting 3 miles away. All they had to do was gather evidence and get out alive. $20,000 on the bull," someone shouted behind them. "You're crazy, man. Look at the size of that shepherd." Money changed hands as bookmakers worked the crowd. Marcus watched a woman in a fur coat, who looked like she should be at a charity gala instead of a dogfight, place a bet for $50,000 without blinking. The dogs clashed in the center of the pit with a sound that made Marcus's soul hurt. The crowd roared its approval. Through the chaos, he spotted their target, Vincent the broker Castellano, the man whose name had come up in every investigation. He sat in a box seat overlooking the pit, flanked by bodyguards and speaking quietly into a satellite phone. "There," Marcus whispered to Tank. "Second-tier red shirt." Tank nodded. Getting to Castellano would be impossible with all the security, but they didn't need to get close. The camera would capture enough to prove his involvement, and the FBI had assured them that would be sufficient for a conviction. The fight below ended badly. Marcus forced himself to keep watching as handlers dragged the losing dog away. He thought of Lucy, safe now in Sarah's clinic, her gentle eyes and the way she'd learned to trust again. Every dog here had been like her once, innocent, loving, before humans twisted them into weapons. "Next fight's the main event," the announcer bellowed. 2-time champion Ripper versus the newcomer they call Ghost. The gate opened, and Marcus's blood turned to ice. The dog they brought out wasn't a typical fighting breed. It was a golden retriever, gaunt and terrified, with fresh scars suggesting it had been recently trained for this moment. The crowd laughed at its obvious fear. "This is wrong," Marcus growled, starting forward. This is so goddamn wrong. Tank caught his arm. Marcus, no. You blow our cover now and we get nothing. These dogs die for nothing. That dog's going to die anyway. But the evidence we gather tonight saves hundreds more. The second gate opened. Ripper emerged. A massive beast that barely looked like a dog anymore, so scarred and muscled it resembled something prehistoric. The golden retriever cowered against the fence. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling something fundamental break inside him. When he opened them again, his hand was already moving toward the fire alarm on the wall beside him. Marcus, don't! The alarm shrieked through the warehouse, drowning out the crowd's bloodthirsty cheers. His ribs still ached from the beating Rodriguez's men had given him 2 days ago, but the pain only sharpened his focus. Sarah's veterinary clinic had been torched the night before, and though she'd escaped unharmed, the message was clear: back off or face worse consequences. Gentlemen, place your final bets, a voice boomed over the PA system. Tonight's main event features Diablo, undefeated in 12 matches, against the newcomer, Razor. Tank's jaw clenched as he recognized Rodriguez in the crowd, wearing a tailored suit and accepting congratulations from other well-dressed men. The crime boss had transformed what should have been illegal backyard fights into a sophisticated entertainment empire, complete with online streaming and international betting networks. Moving carefully through the shadows, Tank worked his way closer to the administrative area where he could see laptops and filing cabinets. If Detective Morrison was right, breaking up this operation would require more than just witness testimony. They needed documentation of the money flows, the breeding operations, and the network of participants. The crowd's roar intensified as the first fight began. Tank forced himself not to look, focusing instead on the security guard blocking his path to the office area. The man was checking his phone, distracted by the spectacle. Tank waited for the crowd noise to peak, then moved swiftly, slipping a sleeper hold around the guard's neck until he went limp. Inside the makeshift office, Tank's hands flew over the papers scattered across multiple desks. Breeding records showed systematic programs designed to produce the most aggressive animals possible. Financial documents revealed a network spanning 3 states with gross revenues in the millions. Most disturbing were the veterinary records, showing how injured animals were patched up with minimal care and forced back into fighting. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, cops moving into position. "You have 10 minutes. Tank photographed everything he could, stuffing the most damning documents into his jacket. The sound of approaching footsteps made him freeze. Through the office window, he could see Rodriguez's lieutenant scanning the crowd, clearly looking for something or someone. "Find him," Rodriguez's voice carried over the noise. "The biker's here somewhere. I can feel it." Tank's escape route back to the oil drums was blocked. The only way out led directly past the fighting rings, through the heart of the crowd. He pulled his baseball cap low and started walking, trying to blend in with the spectators moving between betting stations. "There!" someone shouted behind him. "That's him!" A gunshot echoed through the warehouse, followed by screams. Tank realized Morrison's team had moved in early, probably because his cover was blown. Police sirens wailed outside as SWAT officers poured through multiple entrances. Rodriguez appeared directly in Tank's path, pulling a pistol from his jacket. "You just cost me everything, biker." "Good," Tank replied, not slowing down. The crime boss raised his weapon, but Tank was already diving to the side as Detective Morrison's voice boomed through a megaphone. "Police! Everyone down!" In the ensuing chaos, Rodriguez disappeared into the panicking crowd. Tank helped direct fleeing spectators toward the exits, while officers secured the fighting rings and freed the animals. Sarah appeared at his side, leading a team of veterinarians who'd been waiting outside. "The dogs?" Tank asked, breathing hard. "We'll save everyone we can," she promised, already moving toward the injured animals. As handcuffs clicked on dozens of participants, Tank watched the systematic dismantling of Rodriguez's empire. Computer hard drives were seized, financial records confiscated, and the breeding facilities' locations extracted from captured organizers. But Rodriguez himself had vanished, and Tank knew this wasn't over. Men like that didn't forgive, and they didn't forget. The war for these animals' lives had just entered a deadlier phase. Morrison approached, nodding grimly. "We got most of them, but the big fish slipped away." Tank touched his jacket where the stolen documents were hidden. "Maybe, but we got something he doesn't know about yet." The warehouse district stretched before Marcus like a concrete graveyard, shadows pooling between abandoned buildings under the pale morning light. He'd been riding for 3 hours, following leads that Detective Sarah Chen had quietly passed along through Jake. The underground fighting ring had tentacles reaching deeper than anyone imagined, and Marcus was about to grab hold of one. His Harley rumbled to a stop outside a nondescript building with boarded windows and rust-stained walls. According to Chen's intel, this was where they processed the betting money before it got laundered through a network of legitimate businesses. Marcus killed the engine and listened. The silence felt wrong, too complete, too practiced. The side door yielded to his lockpicks after 30 seconds of work, a skill he'd learned during his wilder years that he'd never quite forgotten. Inside the warehouse was a maze of shipping containers and makeshift offices. The smell hit him immediately, disinfectant trying to mask something fouler underneath. Blood, fear, death. He moved carefully between the containers, following a path worn into the concrete floor. Voices echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, muffled, businesslike. Marcus crept closer, his boots silent on the dusty ground. "Shipment from Phoenix arrives Thursday. Vincetti wants the big one ready for Saturday's main event." The voice was gravelly, authoritative. "What about the heat? Cops been sniffing around since that farm got raided." "Small potatoes. We got people inside the department keeping us clean. Besides, who's going to care about a bunch of mutts?" Marcus's jaw clenched. These bastards talked about the dogs like they were inventory. He edged around a container and peered through a gap in the makeshift wall. 3 men sat around a folding table covered with stacks of cash and betting slips. The one doing most of the talking was built like a linebacker, with prison tattoos crawling up his neck. "The Angels biker who found the farm, what's his status?" Prison Tats asked. "Handled. Russo's boys are tracking him. Won't be a problem much longer." Marcus felt ice form in his veins. He'd known they were hunting him, but hearing it confirmed made it real. These weren't just dogfighters. They were killers with reach and resources. A phone buzzed. Prison Tats answered with a grunt. "Yeah? When? How many cops?" His face darkened as he listened. "Fuck! Pack it up! Move everything to the secondary location." The men started grabbing money and papers with practiced efficiency. Marcus realized his window was closing fast. He needed evidence, something concrete that Chen could use. His phone was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to use it, camera recording as the men stuffed cash into duffel bags. That's when Prison Tats looked up and saw him. "We got company." Marcus ran. Behind him, shouts erupted and footsteps pounded concrete. He weaved between containers as gunshots cracked through the warehouse, bullets sparking off metal. His Harley was 50 yards away, might as well have been 50 miles. A container door slammed open to his left, and a gunman emerged. Marcus tackled him before he could raise his weapon, and they went down hard. The guns skittered away as they grappled on the floor. Marcus landed a solid right cross, and the man went limp. 2 more gunmen rounded the corner ahead, weapons drawn. Marcus dove behind a forklift as bullets chewed up the concrete where he'd been standing. His mind raced through options. The main door was blocked. The side door he'd entered through was too far. But there, a loading dock with the bay door partially raised. He sprinted for it, keeping low as gunfire erupted behind him. A bullet tugged at his leather jacket. Another shattered a window somewhere in the darkness. He hit the concrete outside and rolled, coming up, running toward his bike. The Harley roared to life as Prison Tats and his men poured out of the warehouse. Marcus gunned it, rear wheels spinning gravel as more shots rang out. A bullet spider-webbed his mirror, another sparked off the pavement beside him. Then he was around the corner and flying down the empty street, heart hammering against his ribs. In his pocket, his phone held the evidence Chen needed: names, faces, money changing hands. But it had cost him. Now they knew he was actively hunting them instead of just hiding. His phone rang as he pulled into a gas station 5 miles away. Jake's number. "Marcus, where the hell are you?" Chen just called. They found Tommy Russo's body in a drainage ditch. Single gunshot to the head. Marcus felt the world tilt. Russo had been one of the dogfighters they'd identified, a small-time player. When? This morning. Professional hit. Chen thinks they're cleaning house, eliminating loose ends. Jake's voice was tight. "Brother, I think you just became the loosest end of all." Marcus stared at his reflection in the gas station window, a man caught between two worlds with nowhere left to run. The warehouse district looked different in daylight, its shadows shorter but somehow more menacing. Jake crouched behind a rusted shipping container, watching the nondescript building where Marcus had arranged the meet. 3 black SUVs sat in the parking lot like sleeping predators, their tinted windows reflecting the grey October sky. "You sure about this, brother?" Tommy's voice crackled through the earpiece, barely audible above the distant hum of traffic. The prospect was positioned on a rooftop 2 blocks away, with binoculars and a clear view of all exits. "Hell no," Jake muttered, checking his .45 one last time before sliding it back into his jacket. "But those dogs don't have time for me to be sure." Detective Sarah Chen's voice cut through the static. "Remember, we need solid evidence. Audio, video, something that'll stick in court. And Jake..." A pause carried weight. "Don't be a hero. We've got unit stage 3 minutes out." Jake almost smiled at that. 3 minutes might as well be 3 hours if things went sideways. But Chen had kept her word so far, feeding him intel while keeping the heat off the Angel's other operations. It was an uneasy truce built on mutual respect and a shared hatred of what they'd uncovered. The warehouse door opened and Marcus stepped out, scanning the area with practiced paranoia. He wore an expensive suit that couldn't quite hide the prison ink crawling up his neck. Behind him emerged 2 men Jake didn't recognize. One Asian, built like a linebacker, the other thin and pale with the dead eyes of a career killer. Jake took a deep breath and stepped into view. "Well, well," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the empty lot. "The biker with a conscience. Didn't think you'd show. Told you I wanted in." Jake's boots crunched on broken asphalt as he approached. "Question is whether you're serious about making money or just wasting my time." Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced. "Your time?" "Brother, I've got buyers from 3 states coming in tonight. High rollers who drop 50 grand on a single fight. And here you are, playing animal rescue." "Those dogs you had me dispose of," Jake said, letting genuine anger creep into his voice. "That was wasteful. Half of them could have been saved, trained up, made profitable. Instead, you're burning through inventory like an amateur." The Asian man stepped forward, hand moving inside his jacket. "This feel like a setup to you, Marcus. Nobody finds our operation by accident." Jake forced himself to stay loose, ready. "Your operation? Man, half the county knows something's up. Dogs disappearing, weird traffic at all hours, bodies turning up in the river. You want to keep playing cowboy? Or you want to make some real money? Bodies in the river?" Marcus's eyes narrowed. "What bodies?" "The vet, Dr. Williams, found him yesterday." Jake watched their faces carefully. The pale man's expression didn't change, but Marcus looked genuinely surprised. "Interesting. That wasn't..." Marcus caught himself, glanced at his companions. "Look, things got complicated. Williams was asking too many questions, threatening to go to the cops. So you solved it permanently," Jake said. "Sloppy. Now you've got heat you don't need and a mess that points back to you." The thin man finally spoke, his voice like sandpaper. "You're awfully interested in our business practices for someone who claims he just wants in." Jake shrugged. "I've been running with the Angels for 15 years. You don't survive that long by being stupid. Your setup's amateur hour, Too visible, too messy, too many loose ends. But the money's real, so I figure maybe you need some professional guidance. Professional guidance. Marcus seemed to be weighing something. What exactly are you proposing? New location, better security, cleaner disposal methods. I've got connections you don't. Truckers who'll move your animals, no questions asked. Fight venues that won't draw attention. Buyers who pay premium for quality stock. Jake paused, letting that sink in. Course, I'd need to see the operation first. Can't improve what I don't understand. The three men exchanged glances. Jake felt sweat trickling down his back despite the cool air. If they said no, walked away, the trail would go cold, more dogs would die, more fights would happen. Williams would be just another unsolved murder. Tommy, he sub-vocalized, barely moving his lips. Anything? 2 more vehicles just pulled up around back. Armed men getting out. This is looking less like a meet and more like a trap. Jake's hand inched toward his weapon, but Marcus was already nodding. All right, biker. You want to see professional? Follow us. But understand, once you're inside, you're committed. We don't give guided tours to people who might change their minds. As they approached the warehouse door, the Asian man dropped back to walk beside him. For your sake, he said quietly, I hope you're everything you claim to be. Jake smiled grimly. Trust me, friend. I'm exactly what you need. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Detroit felt like stepping into hell itself. Marcus gripped his Harley's handlebars tighter as he pulled up to the loading dock, the rumble of dozens of motorcycles echoing off the concrete walls. The intel from Razor had been solid. Tonight was the monthly gathering where Vega's network converged to settle accounts and plan the next round of fights. Sarah's voice crackled through his earpiece. Remember, we need evidence of the money flow and confirmation of the next fight location. FBI units are positioned 2 blocks out. Marcus killed his engine and surveyed the scene. Chrome and leather everywhere, but these weren't the kind of bikers he'd grown up with. These men had dead eyes and trigger-happy reputations. Vincent Vega's operation attracted the worst kind of criminal, the ones who found pleasure in watching suffering. Well, Tank Morrison. The voice belonged to Spider Corelli, Vega's lieutenant, a wiry man with neck tattoos and gold teeth. Heard you've been asking questions about our business. Marcus kept his expression neutral. Heard you got opportunities for someone with my skill set. Spider circled him slowly, sizing him up. Your skill set, huh? Word is you got a soft spot for mutts these days. The comment was a test, Marcus realized. Someone had been talking, but how much did they really know? He forced a laugh. Soft spot for profit, maybe. Heard there's good money in your fights. There is, for the right people. Spider gestured toward the warehouse entrance. Vega wants to meet you himself. Don't make any sudden moves in there, Tank. Lot of nervous trigger fingers tonight. Inside, the warehouse buzzed with activity. Tables were set up with laptops and stacks of cash. Men stood around smoking and drinking, their conversations a mix of Spanish, English, and street slang. Marcus counted at least 30 armed men, all wearing the same distinctive red bandana that marked them as part of Vega's crew. Vincent Vega sat at the far end of the warehouse on what looked like a makeshift throne, an ornate chair surrounded by monitors showing live feeds from various locations. He was younger than Marcus had expected, maybe 40, with expensive clothes that couldn't hide the prison tattoos on his hands. The famous Tank Morrison, Vega said without looking up from the screens. You know, I've been wondering why a Hell's Angel with your reputation would suddenly develop an interest in my operation. Marcus stepped closer, noting the positions of the guards. Money talks louder than reputation. Does it? Vega finally looked at him, dark eyes calculating. Because I'm hearing some interesting stories. Stories about you sniffing around that farm, about you asking questions in places you shouldn't be asking them. The warehouse fell silent. Marcus felt every eye on him, hands drifting toward weapons. This was the moment, fight or flight, live or die. Yeah, I checked out the farm, Marcus said, taking a gamble. Wanted to see what kind of operation I might be getting into. Pretty impressive setup you had there." Vega smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Had being the operative phrase. "See, we had to relocate after some unwanted attention. Cost me a lot of money, Tank. Made me paranoid about who I can trust." One of the monitors caught Marcus's attention, a live feed showing a concrete pit surrounded by cheering spectators. In the center, two scarred and bloodied dogs circled each other, while men waved fistfuls of cash. His jaw tightened involuntarily. "Problem with the entertainment?" Vega asked, noticing his expression. "Just wondering about the profit margins," Marcus replied quickly. "Seems like a lot of overhead for the return." Smart man, thinking about the business side. Vega stood and walked over to a table covered with documents. "The fights are just one revenue stream. We've got breeding operations, training facilities, transport networks. It's a multi-million-dollar enterprise." As Vega spoke, Marcus activated the hidden camera in his jacket button, making sure to capture the documents and the live feeds. Sarah's voice whispered in his earpiece, "Perfect. Keep him talking." "The beauty of this business," Vega continued, "is that the product is self-renewing. Dogs breed, we train the promising ones, dispose of the weak ones. Very efficient." Marcus felt his hands clench into fists. The casual way Vega discussed the animal's suffering, the cold calculation of it all. It took every ounce of self-control not to grab the man by the throat. "I like efficiency," he managed to say. "Good, because I'm about to offer you a job." Vega picked up a tablet and showed Marcus a map with red dots marking various locations. "We're expanding into new territories. Need someone with your connections in the MC world to help us establish footholds. Interested?" Marcus studied the map, memorizing the locations. At least a dozen sites spread across 3 states. The operation was even bigger than they'd imagined. "What's the compensation?" he asked. "For the right man, 20% of regional profits. Could be 7 figures annually." The offer hung in the air like a loaded gun. Marcus knew his answer would determine whether he walked out of this warehouse alive. The warehouse felt like a tomb when Marcus stepped inside, the metallic tang of blood still hanging in the air despite the chaos having ended hours ago. Emergency lights cast eerie shadows across the concrete floor where broken cages lay scattered like the bones of some massive beast. He picked his way carefully through the debris, his boots crunching on shattered glass and splintered wood. Detective Sarah Chen appeared from behind an overturned truck, her face grim but determined. "We've got enough evidence here to put Castellano away for 3 lifetimes, she said, gesturing toward a series of filing cabinets that had been cracked open during the raid. Financial records, betting logs, correspondence with other fighting operations across 5 states. This was bigger than we imagined. Marcus nodded, though his attention was drawn to the far corner where veterinarians were still working with the rescued animals. The sight of those broken creatures being gently coaxed into transport carriers made his chest tight. "What about the dogs that didn't make it?" 17 confirmed dead on sight, Chen replied softly. "But we saved 43. That's 43 lives that would have been lost if you hadn't stumbled onto that farm." The words should have brought comfort, but Marcus felt only the weight of those 17 failures pressing down on his shoulders. He'd seen death before, plenty of it, but there was something about the senseless brutality of what had happened here that cut deeper than any knife wound he'd ever taken. His phone buzzed. Tommy's name flashed on the screen. "Brother, you need to get back to the clubhouse. Now." Tommy's voice carried an urgency that made Marcus's blood run cold. "What's wrong? Just get here, and watch your back on the way." "Go," she said. "We've got everything under control here. But Marcus, be careful. Castellano had connections we're still uncovering. This might not be over." The ride back to the clubhouse felt like navigating through a minefield. Every car that followed too closely, every figure lingering on street corners, every shadow that seemed out of place set his nerves on edge. The Harley's engine roared beneath him, but even its familiar comfort couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The clubhouse parking lot was unusually full for a Tuesday afternoon. Marcus counted at least a dozen bikes he didn't recognize, their chrome gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Inside, the main room buzzed with conversation that died the moment he walked through the door. Tommy stood behind the bar, his face carved from stone. Surrounding him were members from chapters Marcus hadn't seen in years, guys from Oakland, Sacramento, even a few from down south. The president of the mother chapter, a grizzled veteran named Iron Mike, sat at the head table with documents spread before him. "Marcus," Iron Mike's voice carried the authority of 4 decades in the club. "Sit down, son, we need to talk." The room felt smaller with every step Marcus took toward the table. He'd been in situations like this before, club business that required the full weight of the organization's attention. But this felt different. This felt personal. "You stirred up a hornet's nest," Iron Mike continued, once Marcus had taken a seat. "This Castellano character you helped bring down? He's connected to people who don't like their business interests disrupted. Word is there's a price on your head." Marcus felt the familiar calm settle over him, the same steadiness that had carried him through combat zones and bar fights and every dangerous situation life had thrown his way. "How much?" 50,000. The number hung in the air like smoke. "These aren't street thugs, Marcus. These are professionals, the kind who don't miss." Around the room, faces that had known Marcus for years watched him with a mixture of concern and respect. These men understood loyalty, understood the bonds that held them together, but they also understood survival. "Here's what's going to happen," Iron Mike said, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "We've got a safe house up in Oregon. Remote place, off the grid. You're going to disappear for a while. Let the heat cool down." Marcus stared at the envelope without touching it. "And the dogs?" Tommy stepped forward. "Already being taken care of. The rescue organizations have them placed in foster homes and rehabilitation facilities. They're safe." "This isn't about running," Iron Mike added, reading Marcus's expression. "This is about staying alive long enough to see justice done. Chen thinks it'll take about 6 months to roll up the rest of the network. After that, these contracts tend to expire on their own." Marcus finally reached for the envelope, feeling its weight in his hands. Inside would be new identification, cash, directions to a place where he could wait out the storm he'd created by doing the right thing. 6 months, he said quietly. 6 months, Iron Mike confirmed. "Then you come home." The warehouse district felt like a graveyard at 3 in the morning, shadows dancing between rusted shipping containers and abandoned loading docks. Jake gripped his handlebars tighter as he rolled his Harley to a stop behind a dumpster, the engine's rumble echoing off concrete walls before dying into silence. 50 yards ahead, the target building squatted like a cancer among the industrial decay. Detective Rodriguez emerged from behind a parked semi, her tactical vest making her look smaller than usual. "You sure about this, Jake? Once we go in, there's no turning back." Jake nodded, checking the wire taped to his chest one more time. The plan was simple in theory, catastrophic if it went wrong. He'd go in wearing the recording device, try to get Kozlov to confess to the dogfighting operation, the murder of Tommy Chen, and whatever other crimes they could pin on him. The FBI and local SWAT teams were positioned around the perimeter, waiting for his signal. "Remember," Agent Morrison's voice crackled through Jake's earpiece, "we need him talking about the dogs, the fights, the money laundering. Get him comfortable, let his ego do the work." Jake stripped off his leather jacket, revealing the sleeveless shirt underneath. The wire felt like ice against his skin. "What if he searches me?" "The device is sewn into the shirt seam. Unless he strips you naked, we should be good." Rodriguez handed him a small pistol. "Insurance policy. Keep it in your boot." The weight of the gun felt foreign against his ankle as Jake walked toward the warehouse entrance. Every step brought back memories of his father, of promises broken and trust shattered. But this time was different. This time he was choosing which side of the line to stand on. 2 guards flanked the entrance, both armed and alert. Jake recognized one from the night at Kozlov's estate. "He's expecting me," Jake said, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. The guards patted him down perfunctorily, their search stopping at his waist. The ankle holster went undetected. They led him through a maze of corridors that reeked of sweat, blood, and fear. The familiar sounds reached him first. Barking, growling, men shouting bets and curses. His stomach clenched. The main floor opened up into a scene from hell. A fighting pit dominated the center, surrounded by bleachers packed with spectators. 2 dogs circled each other in the ring, both scarred and desperate. Jake forced himself to watch, to remember why he was here. "Beautiful sight, isn't it?" Kozlov's voice came from behind him. The Russian wore an expensive suit that looked obscene in this place of suffering. Raw nature, stripped of all pretense. No mercy, no second chances. "It's something, all right." Jake turned to face him, acutely aware of every word being transmitted to the team outside. "You've built quite an operation here." Kozlov smiled, gesturing toward a private booth overlooking the pit. "This is just the beginning. Do you know how much money flows through this warehouse every week? Millions. And the beauty is, who's going to report stolen drug money or weapons sales? Everyone here is already dirty." "Your father would have loved this," Kozlov continued, pouring himself a drink from a crystal decanter. He understood that sentiment is weakness. That Chinese detective, for instance, he let his conscience make him stupid. Jake's jaw tightened. "Tommy Chen? What happened to him?" "He got too close, started asking questions about our dog procurement methods. I gave him a chance to walk away, even offered him money, but he chose to be a hero instead." Kozlov shrugged. "Heroes don't last long in my world. We found him at that farm, taking pictures, gathering evidence. My associate convinced him to delete everything permanently." The admission hit Jake like a physical blow, but he forced himself to stay calm. "And the farm? How many dogs did you take from there?" "Over the years, maybe 500, 600. The old man who owned it was senile, didn't even notice when we helped ourselves. When he died, we just kept using it as a dumping ground for the ones too damaged to fight anymore." Kozlov laughed. "Efficient, no? Let them starve instead of wasting bullets." Jake's hands clenched into fists, but he caught himself. The recording device was getting everything. What about the witnesses, other cops who might have known what Chen was investigating? "All handled. You'd be surprised how many people will look the other way for the right price or the right threat." Kozlov leaned closer. "But enough about business. You didn't come here to discuss my methods. You came here because you're finally ready to claim your birthright." Below them, one of the dogs had fallen. The crowd roared its approval while handlers dragged the wounded animal away. Jake knew he'd heard enough, gotten everything the prosecution would need. Now came the hard part, getting out alive. He reached slowly for his boot, feeling for the pistol's grip. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Phoenix looked like every other derelict building in the industrial district, but Jake knew better. Inside those crumbling walls, the final piece of Marcus Volkov's empire would be waiting. The underground fighting ring had moved here after their compound raid 2 weeks ago, desperate to salvage what remained of their operation. Jake adjusted the wire taped to his chest, the small recording device feeling heavier than his Harley. Detective Sarah Chen's voice crackled through his earpiece one last time before he cut the connection. "Remember, we need Volkov's confession about the dogfighting and the murders. Don't be a hero, Jake." Too late for that, he thought, pushing through the warehouse's rusted side door. The stench hit him immediately, blood, fear, and the acrid smell of desperate men clinging to their last profits. The main floor had been converted into a makeshift arena, complete with portable floodlights and tiered seating cobbled together from shipping pallets. About 50 men clustered around the fighting pit, their voices a low rumble of bets and anticipation. Jake recognized several faces from his Hell's Angels days, back when he'd run in darker circles. Tommy Razor Morrison spotted him first, his scarred face breaking into a gold-toothed grin. "Well, well. Look what the cat dragged in." Razor's hand moved instinctively toward the gun bulge under his jacket. "Heard you went soft, Steel. Playing hero with mutts now." "Just came to see what all the fuss was about," Jake replied. keeping his voice steady. "Word is Volkov's putting on quite a show." The crowd parted slightly, revealing the pit below. Two pit bulls circled each other, both bearing fresh wounds. Jake's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to watch, to play the part. These dogs looked nothing like the skeletal creatures he'd rescued from the farm. These were muscle-bound killing machines, bred and trained for one purpose. "You like what you see?" The voice came from behind him, smooth and accented. Jake turned to face Marcus Volkov himself, a thin man in an expensive suit that looked out of place in the grimy warehouse. His pale eyes held the cold calculation of a shark. "Impressive operation," Jake said. "Heard you had some trouble recently." Volkov's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "Temporary setbacks. The authorities shut down our breeding facility, but they cannot stop market demand. These fights bring in 200,000 per night." Jake pulled out a roll of cash, his life savings actually, and made a show of counting it. "Mind if I place a bet? Been too long since I had skin in the game." "Of course. Though I should mention, we've had to increase our security measures." Volkov gestured subtly, and Jake noticed 3 armed men positioned around the warehouse perimeter. "Some bleeding hearts have been causing problems for our business. They don't understand that these animals live to fight. It's their nature." "Right," Jake said, moving closer to the pit's edge. "Just like it was natural for you to murder that veterinarian who tried to expose you?" The words hung in the air like a lit fuse. Volkov's expression didn't change, but Jake felt the atmosphere shift around them. Several conversations stopped mid-sentence. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Volkov said carefully. Jake pressed forward, knowing this was his only chance. "Come on, Marcus. We're all criminals here. Dr. Patterson found your breeding operation, threatened to go public, so you had him killed and made it look like a robbery. Smart move, except you missed something." Volkov's hand moved to his jacket pocket. "And what was that?" Patterson had already documented everything. Photos, financial records, the whole network, hidden in a safety deposit box that the cops found last week. It was a lie, but a convincing one. Volkov's composure finally cracked, his face flushing with anger. "That sanctimonious fool should have minded his own business, just like you should now." "So you admit it?" Jake pressed. "You ordered his death?" "I ordered the elimination of a threat to a $60 million operation," Volkov snapped. "Patterson, that farmhand Rodriguez, anyone who got in our way. This business requires decisive action." The confession sent adrenaline surging through Jake's veins. He had what he needed, but getting out alive was another matter entirely. Volkov had realized his mistake, his face going pale as he processed what he'd just admitted. "Kill him," Volkov ordered quietly. His phone buzzed with a text from Chen, 2 minutes out. 2 minutes might as well have been 2 hours. Jake counted muzzle flashes in the darkness, calculating angles and distances. 3 shooters, maybe 4. His own pistol felt inadequate against those odds, but he'd come too far to quit now. The warehouse doors exploded inward as SWAT teams flooded the building, their tactical lights cutting through the chaos like laser beams. The warehouse echoed with the sound of steel doors slamming shut as the last of the federal agents secured the scene. Marcus watched from his position near the loading dock, his leather jacket torn and bloodied, but his eyes focused on the cages being loaded onto the ASPCA transport trucks. Even from a distance, he could see the fear in the dog's eyes beginning to soften as gentle hands reached through the bars with food and water. Marcus nodded, watching as volunteers carefully lifted a scarred pit bull from one of the cages. The dog's tail gave a tentative wag, the first sign of hope he'd shown since being rescued. "Those animals didn't ask for any of this." "Neither did you, from what I understand." Chen's voice carried a note of respect. "We found Rodriguez's ledgers. This operation was pulling in over $2 million a year. The betting alone—" She shook her head. "They would have killed you without a second thought." The sound of motorcycle engines rumbled outside, and Marcus turned to see Diesel and 3 other club members pulling up to the warehouse. His stomach tightened. After everything that had happened, the betrayal, the lies, the violence, he wasn't sure where he stood with the Angels anymore. Diesel's boots echoed across the concrete as he approached. His face was unreadable, the same stone mask Marcus had seen him wear during club business for 15 years. The other members flanked him, including Throttle, whose arm was still in a sling from the previous night's confrontation. "Feds treating you right?" Diesel asked, his voice neutral. "Better than expected." Marcus met his president's gaze directly. "I know what this looks like. It looks like you chose to do the right thing." Diesel's response surprised him. "It also looks like you took down some sick bastards who were using our name and reputation to cover their tracks." Agent Chen stepped forward. "Mr. Torres cooperated fully with our investigation. Without his help, we never would have uncovered the full scope of the operation. Rodriguez was planning to expand into 3 more states." Throttle spat on the ground. "Rodriguez wasn't one of us. Never was, really. Just wore the colors." "The club voted last night," Diesel continued. "Unanimous decision. Rodriguez and his crew are out, permanently. And you—" He paused, studying Marcus's face. "You're still our brother. What you did took guts." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying for weeks. "I thought I'd lost everything." "The only thing you lost was some dead weight," Diesel replied. "The dogs you saved from that farm, how are they doing?" "Good. Real good." Marcus couldn't help but smile. "Dr. Martinez says most of them will make full recoveries. The rescue organization has adoption applications coming in from all over the state." A commotion near one of the transport trucks caught their attention. A volunteer was struggling with a large German Shepherd mix, one of the fighting dogs that had been too traumatized to handle easily. The dog was backing into a corner of the cage, growling and shaking. "Easy, girl," he murmured, extending his hand palm up. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." The dog's growling subsided slightly. Her ears twitched forward, catching something in his voice that registered as safe. After what felt like an eternity, she stretched her neck forward and sniffed his fingers. "She knows you understand." Dr. Martinez had appeared beside him, her voice soft. "Animals can sense when someone has been through trauma themselves." Marcus stayed motionless as the dog's rough tongue tentatively licked his hand. The simple gesture of trust hit him harder than any punch he'd ever taken. "We're going to need volunteers," Dr. Martinez continued. "People who understand that healing takes time, that some scars run deeper than others." "I know a few guys who might be interested," Diesel said from behind them. "Turns out bikers and rescue dogs have more in common than most people think." As the transport trucks began pulling away, Marcus stood and watched them disappear into the night. 200 dogs were heading toward new lives, toward families who would love them, patients that would heal them, and safety they'd never known. Agent Chen approached one final time. "Rodriguez's trial starts in 6 months. We'll need you to testify. I'll be there." Marcus pulled his jacket tighter against the evening chill. Those animals deserve justice. The warehouse fell silent, except for the distant rumble of motorcycles starting up. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Marcus Torres, biker, outlaw, and unexpected hero, finally felt like he could breathe again. Sarah walked beside him, her notebook tucked under her arm, the Pulitzer Prize nomination letter still fresh in her jacket pocket. Her investigative series had blown the case wide open, but she knew the real hero was the gruff biker who'd first called her tip line about the abandoned farm. "You did it," she said, squeezing his arm. 200 dogs are alive because of you." Jake shook his head, pulling out a crumpled pack of cigarettes before thinking better of it and shoving them back into his pocket. "We did it. Couldn't have taken down that whole operation without your digging." Behind them, Detective Martinez descended the courthouse steps, his tie loosened after the marathon sentencing hearing. The case had been the biggest bust of his career, leading to arrests in 6 states and the shutdown of a network that had been operating for over a decade. "Hell of a thing," Martinez said, joining them on the sidewalk. "Never thought I'd see the day when a Hell's Angel would be getting a commendation from the police chief." Jake snorted. "Still don't trust cops, Martinez. But you're all right." The detective grinned. "High praise coming from you, Kane." A familiar bark echoed from across the street, and Jake's weathered face broke into the closest thing to a smile anyone had seen from him in months. Brutus bounded across the crosswalk, his coat gleaming with health, followed by Dr. Rachel Coleman carrying a worn medical bag. The massive pit bull launched himself at Jake, who caught him in a bear hug that would have crushed a smaller man. "Easy there, boy. Yeah, I missed you too." Rachel approached, her hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn during those grueling weeks of triage at the emergency animal shelter. "The last of the rescued dogs found homes yesterday," she announced. "That makes all 200 placed in loving families or reputable rescue organizations." "Even the ones we thought wouldn't make it?" Jake asked, scratching behind Brutus's ears. "Every single one. That little beagle mix you carried out in your jacket on day one? She's living with a retired teacher in Vermont now, sleeping on silk cushions." Jake's eyes, still hard from decades of living on the margins, softened slightly. In the distance, motorcycles rumbled to life. His brotherhood had waited for him throughout the trial, never wavering in their support despite the media attention and police scrutiny that came with Jake's decision to cooperate with authorities. Tommy pulled up on his Harley, followed by 6 other club members. They'd shed their colors for the courthouse proceedings, but their loyalty was unmistakable. "Ready to ride, brother?" But Jake hesitated, looking back at the courthouse where justice had finally been served, then at the small group of people who'd become unlikely allies in his fight for the voiceless. "Actually," he said, surprising everyone, including himself, "I've got something to do first." Jake knelt beside a simple stone marker, placing a worn bandana that had belonged to the first dog he'd found in that hellish barn. The animal hadn't survived the night, but its suffering had awakened something in Jake that he'd thought died long ago. "I made you a promise," he said quietly to the stone. "Said I'd make them pay. Well, they did." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she watched this hardened criminal, this man who'd lived outside society's rules for most of his adult life, honor the memory of creatures that society had forgotten. When Jake stood, Brutus pressed against his leg, and the big man's hand found the dog's head automatically. The simple gesture spoke volumes about the bond forged in darkness and maintained in light. "So what now?" Rachel asked. Jake looked around at the faces of people who'd started as strangers and become something like family. "Now I keep riding, but maybe I make a few more stops along the way. World's full of things that need protecting." As they walked back toward the motorcycles, Tommy clapped Jake on the shoulder. "Club's proud of you, brother. What you did took real courage." Jake mounted his Harley, Brutus settling into the custom sidecar they'd built for him. The engine roared to life, drowning out the civilized sounds of the nearby city. "Wasn't courage," Jake called over the engine noise. "Was just doing what was right." The motorcycle convoy pulled onto the highway, heading toward whatever horizon awaited them, carrying with them the proof that redemption comes in unexpected forms and that sometimes the most broken souls are the ones capable of the greatest compassion.